screen with you. So you will see what we want to do. We now lost already some minutes, but I think it's not a problem. We will make up time. I'll give a brief introduction. I'll ask for a short round of initial comments. Then we have basically two questions prepared for this breakout group that we want to answer. We should take some time to understand those questions, contextualize them. They're complex questions. Then after having done this, we have prepared a short game for you, a poll, where you can answer the questions. The two questions are split up into 4 yes/no questions, and we can find out what the opinion in this group is, even though it's a small group. And then we should take some minutes for agreeing on what we report back to the group, whether we will find a joint language for what we have discussed. So that's basically it. I don't have to go through the slides of one anymore, because they have been just presented and they should be fresh in your mind. What the objectives are and of the rules of participation, and what the rules of participation themselves are. What we want to achieve is a balance between quality and openness, I would say, with the rules of participation. Striking this balance is not simple, it's not straightforward. We had a lot of discussions on that, but we boiled it down eventually in the group to these 10 rather general statements that one was presenting today. And what we assume will happen, and is also happening right now, is that we will have commentaries on the individual rules where these are discussed, maybe similar in some legal systems at least, to commentaries that you find on laws. We will in fact have a legal study on the implications of what individual rules could mean in terms of legal systems. And what we then foresee, and this is important for our question that we have posed for you today, is that there will be individual implementation guidelines, specific implementation guidelines. That might be for IT, that might be more for literature provision, that might be for thematic areas. And I think the topic of today's discussion is about the thematic areas, thematic research infrastructures. How could they develop individual implementation guidelines for the rules of participation? Should they? What could be the process? So that would be a very interesting exercise for us to understand from the perspective of experts in the field of thematic research infrastructures, what their idea about this is. But first, I want to open the floor briefly for general comments to the rules, so that we can get them addressed and put them on the table here before we really start to work on the questions. Please shoot.
Wolfram, do you want us to use the hand raise feature in participants, or just to speak? You're muted.
I think we can just speak because we're a small group.
Okay, so a general question about open to all, and I understand that this may well be addressed in the commentary, in which case just say read the commentary. Open to all for both users of EOSC services and data, as well as contributors of services into EOSC? In other words, is it open for all kinds of possible contributions in and drawing on EOSC, or is it going to be constrained?
It is in fact a little bit an open question, and we just in the last session of our working group, we had a discussion about that. Is this statement actually true? Probably it's not, because it is for open primarily and meant primarily for the research system, and there are currently still no clear indications on how the involvement of commercial players, for example, should work. So it is probably not exactly true, the statement, but at least what I said, and this is a subjective, so that's a disclaimer statement, is that I think we should keep the statement anyway, because it's an important message to start with. One, maybe you can comment.
It is a very important question, Andrew, and as I said, a lot of these we've been going round on them. In my view, this rule is trying to say there's nothing in principle that is going to stop anyone from participating in any way. Now, when it comes to actual types of participation, there may be additional constraints. So authentication might be one. If you want to use a resource that's, the right word, consumable, then you may have to find a way for that to be compensated. So in the way that access to the research infrastructures, physical research infrastructures, can be open to transnational access, but there's a hurdle you have to get over in terms of scientific merit if you come from outside the country. So I could imagine lots of different systems for controlling access, because it can't just be a free-for-all. But I think there's no point of principle which says its use is restricted to any group.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there further general comments or questions to the rules? Nothing at the moment. I have to observe the chat. Okay. Okay, then I would suggest that we go on the next part, which is actually the main part of this session, which is about the two questions that we would like to have answered and report back on, which are first the question that I already indicated: how would you suggest to develop implementation guidelines according to the rules of participation, as I mentioned before? So there will be generic rules, there will be specific implementation guidelines. Would you suggest to develop implementation guidelines for individual thematic research infrastructures, and or B, for maybe even ESFRI as a whole, as a whole framework for thematic research infrastructures? So it's a rather complex question. We can separate the individual parts, but I will read the second one too. So the second is, how should the editorial process be organized also after the rules of participation have been handed over to the EOSC Association? As Juan mentioned, what we foresee is to hand over our work, which is the rules, which with comments plus legal study plus maybe indicative implementation guidelines for some aspects or communities, to the EOSC Association, to the legal entity in December 2020. And we assume that the EOSC Association will take responsibility for the further process, for further development of the rules. So the question we would like to have input on is, how do you think should this be organized? How should the research infrastructures, the thematic research infrastructures, be involved in that process? If there are different implementation guidelines, if there were, then how could this process further be organized? So as to the first question, which is really about a directional decision that we have to take now, also a recommendation that we have to give to the EOSC Association, the question is, do you think that it would be useful or it would make sense to develop individual implementation guidelines for individual thematic research infrastructures? Or is that a process, to put it a little bit more provocative, is that a process that maybe would be too complex, would capitalize on more or too much on differences rather than commonalities between the different infrastructures? If, for example, life sciences have one and astro has another, and humanities have another. So what is your first take on that? Andrew again?
Yeah, so I don't want to be the only one speaking, and I would encourage other people in the meeting to speak. But the challenge you have, Wolfram and Juan, is that you're trying to build generic infrastructure, and you don't want a situation where two different thematic areas are pulling in different directions or have conflicting demands. And so I think if I can paraphrase a principle, you want something that is as common as possible and different only where necessary. There may be particular areas where there are some differences by thematic research infrastructures, but I think you should be trying to minimize that as far as possible. Otherwise, you'll end up with a, if I can use an unfortunate example, a somewhat balkanized situation within the EOSC, which I think would not be conducive to its long-term success or sustainability.
Philip.
Yes. With regard to a specific EOSC community of provider of resources, which are the high-performance computing communities, we are looking at what's going on EOSC, I would say, since the start of the EOSC project. We have worked with some of you on the EOSC pilot and follow all the EOSC forum since then. But I think this is more than just a question of the rules of participation. This is also a question of implementation of them. And, you know, it's not to, I don't know how to phrase it, but this is not that we want to have something specific. This is just that when you are running a petaflop or tomorrow exaflop machine that performed 1 million billiard operation per second or 1 billiard whatever operation per second, who have specific need. This is why with PRACE, with a human brain project, we have built an architecture called Phoenix, who was aimed at bridging HPC to and EOSC. And if at some given point we are not able to use what we have make what have taken us many years of research and development to link to EOSC, well, we will just not link. We will continue to use what has been developed through EOSC as rules of participation, but there will be two ways to access to numerical resources in Europe. One way through EOSC for some services, and another way through your HPC system providing with the resource provided by Price. And I think it will be a shame if we are not able to bridge the two. But at some given point, yeah, EOSC must also recognize all the work that is performed by some of the other community and be more open to that.
Okay, thank you. I think that was an interesting view from the RI perspective, really. Let's collect a little more before we comment. Rafael, you had a comment. You care to briefly explain?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for the possibility to interact. I would like to suggest that it is necessary in the editorial process to take into account the interest of the different types of members. Not that means that every member should be represented in the editorial process, but collectively the different types of thematics groups and research infrastructures and users. This is, in my opinion, very important because at the same time we avoid to have a very large group of editing, but at the same time the different issues are taken into account. And regarding if it is ESFRI as a whole or thematic, I think that we should start by ESFRI and later on, depending on the needs and the possibilities to go to the thematic. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there further reflections on the questions? Basically, we have already, I would say, the two opposing sides here. One is about really taking care about the individual developments that are already there and reflecting this experience in the process of implementing the rules and also editing them over time. Or editing implementation guidelines. And the other one is we have to keep it together. So we should really look at the commonalities first. I'm summarizing that in a slightly polarized fashion. Are there any further reflections on this? So I have to get the chat here always. If you imagine the process at the moment, so let's imagine that there will be Anna Hellman has raised her hand, so I keep my sentence in mind and we'll come to that later. Anna, please.
Thank you very much. So I am Anna Hellman and I'm representing the project called CATRIS, standing for Catalog of Research Infrastructure Services, and which focuses basically on services provided by physical research infrastructure's core facilities. So it's in a bit, let's say, not directly the central focus of EOSC catalog. We try to be complementary and also interoperable with the EOSC catalog. But one of the comments I had is concerning these rules of participation, since we are thinking about this, and in particular when we talk about this type of infrastructures that are offering, let's say, different types of services than data or software exclusively. Maybe what could seem like an approach is rather to focus on disciplinary specificities, to focus on the specificities of conditions for access. So the typologies of access to a specific service, whether it's remote access, access to physical access, or some other type of access, or maybe consider the type of services that an infrastructure or a group of infrastructures is providing. So this is something we observe in our project as a commonality for infrastructures across different disciplines. So I don't know if this makes sense also from the point of view of this specific group, but it's just a comment I wanted to make. It also relates to discussion in a previous breakout session about a way to interface this, let's say, analytical facilities or facilities that offer other types of services into EOSC.
Yeah, no, I think it makes absolute sense. And in a way, it's also a question of the capacity we have to develop specific implementation guidelines for the rules of participation that can be practical and then can be binding. And there are several angles you can take, and one of them would be, for example, the categories of access. We had this discussion about, for example, having specific for end users. So one mentioned this differentiation between providers and users, and also between data and services. You could also imagine that you have different implementation guidelines for different people first, before starting the process of developing some for the implementation guideline for the thematic research infrastructures. But this is exactly what I was trying to mention now, just to get a little bit deeper into the understanding of the question. So you see, sorry, no, I'm just putting them back here. It's also really a question of process eventually. And I come to question 2 now. The EOSC Association is a membership organization. And you could imagine that the ESFRI process and the different research infrastructures that are organized in the ESFRI process, or even represented by the ESFRI process, could participate in the whole of the EOSC through the EOSC Association, which also would include the rules of participation. So you could say, well, in this case, we don't actually need any specific editorial group or something within the EOSC Association that is looking after the rules of participation with any specific representation of the research infrastructures or of ESFRI. So it's just being organized through the membership process that is available. Would you think that this is sufficient, or do you think that we need a specific representation of the research infrastructures in the further process of organizing the rules of participation and the implementation guidelines for thematic research infrastructures, respectively? Yeah, so we're already being alerted that we have to close the room at a certain point. Probably the question was a little complex, but I think it is important to just to think in the future about how this process should be really organized and how the research infrastructure should be represented in this process. So we have broken it down to this question into a yes and no questions here, and I can give you. You obviously cannot click the link on your screen that you see there, but I can click it and I will post it in the chat, so you will see the questions there and everybody can look at it in parallel. So I will, if they allow me, I will post it in the chat. I will stop screen sharing for a while.
Where is the link to the poll?
Yeah, I will post it in the chat if the control bar appears, which is always a little hidden when you're moderating. So do you see it now in the chat? And does it work? Because, yeah, does it open up a Google form? Okay, very good. So it should also now accept answers. Let me have a look. Yes, so the answer should be on. So the first question, and everybody, you can do that. We're only a few persons, but these will be anonymous, so you can think about the questions, and we will have an immediate idea. Yeah, sorry about the Google form. As I said in my slides, we wanted Mentimeter, but there were not enough licenses. So we had to do something else, and that was the easiest thing available. So we have some responses. Okay. That looks good. Do you now see actually my screen of the responses, or do you see the only the presentation?
Only the presentation.
Only the presentation. So let me. Can you see the responses now? No?
No.
Yet.
Perfect. So, well, we have at least an interesting picture here, which looks like that the question whether there should be individual implementation guidelines for the rules for thematic research infrastructures is kind of split. There are more people saying that ESFRI should have an organizing role in that, which is an interesting feedback for ESFRI, I think. Also, we're still collecting answers, but this is just an indication. Here is also interesting. So do you think that basically the question behind that question is, do you think that the EOSC Association should take a strong role in the editorial processes? And what you say is basically yes, but not everybody. And you also suggest very strongly there should be some kind of thematic, of standing representation of a thematic research infrastructure. So, so maybe you could explain a little bit now, preparing for our report, the odd, I would say, statements. So I would be very interested in why people, for example, some, I mean, these were only two persons, I don't know who it was, but maybe you care to explain why you chose to say ESFRI should not have an organizing role in preparing the individual ROP implementation guidelines for thematic research infrastructures. Did anybody cross this?
Yeah, so this is Sanna Soraisuundet. I think that I was the one of the ones to say so. I mean that of course ESFRI has always a strong role on in a dialogue partner and so forth. But when we are discussing about the rule of participation and the implementation guidelines, shouldn't they be directly the thematic research infrastructures or the research infrastructures themselves? I mean, that I would put to that level the role.
Thank you. Very clear.
I think, and again, I think I was the second one to say no here. I think my main thinking here was that ESFRI, indeed, as the previous participant said, has a quite dominant role in this discussion. So maybe to open up a little bit more this rules of participation definition by including possibly other infrastructures, the smaller scale infrastructures directly would, or at least some representatives could also be beneficial to guarantee really an inclusive approach.
Can I say something?
Absolutely, just speak up.
Yes, Fabio Taucher from JRC, European Commission. I also agree with Anna that we should be also more inclusive and not only limit ourselves to ESFRI, but also give a more prominent role to those research infrastructures that are not part of ESFRI.
Mm-hmm. How could that happen? If not,
well, it could happen. Yeah, it could happen, for example, through the infra calls that DGRTD will be launching in Horizon Europe. And these are usually on specific themes. And in these infra calls, you have specific networking activities. And then in these networking activities, you put together the different research infrastructures in Europe that are usually not part of ESFRI. And there you can have specific actions that are addressing the development of the ROP in the European Open Science Cloud.
Okay. Okay. Good point. The third question about the representation, about the responsibility for implementation guidelines. So majority said, yeah, should lie within the EOSC association. Some said no. Again, I would be interested in understanding, if you wish, why you said no or maybe. Okay, no idea. Then I skip that one, go to the next one. There was only one person, obviously, of the 9 responses to say, should there be a standing representation of for the thematic research infrastructures in the ROP implementation guidelines. So in the whole process of the editorial process, in a way, somebody said no. Again, I would give the chance to say why. I can't imagine. For similar reasons, probably because how would you organize a representation of thematic research infrastructures in a representative way? ESFRI is definitely one, but maybe not the exclusive representation. Okay, so Dale, thank you for making the notes. Let's switch to the question of what we report back. It's only 2 minutes, so it will not be, cannot be very long.
Yeah, okay, so so the first slide is just a recap of the questions. That second slide that you're showing now is what I've written so far, summarizing the discussion, but it's not quite finished yet. So we need to complete these bullets. So let's see.
Do you need to complete the bullets, or is it enough just to show the graphs?
Well, it depends what you want to present, I suppose, Wolfram. What's your preference? Because I've pasted all 4 graphs in, as you've seen as well.
I think that the general statements and understanding we don't necessarily need to present, but I'm open to comments and suggestions from you. I'd rather explain the questions a little bit that we pose, because they are rather complex questions, and then maybe show in the meeting the really the answers, just and say that these are only 9 responses. So, but I wouldn't publish them later. But well, they will be recorded, so in a way they are published. But I think this gives a better. I wouldn't put them in the results slide, I would say. Mm-hmm. That's published. We can show them during the meeting, because it gives a good indication of the discussion, I think, and it breaks down the complexity of the questions a little bit. Would you agree with that? Is that okay?
I'm quite comfortable. I mean, you're the one that's going to have to present it, so I mean, perhaps others in the group might have opinions. Are you happy for the graphs to be presented?
I'm very fine with that.
Thank you.
I think especially the first one's important to present, because it shows how opinion is divided.
Yeah. So there is
how difficult this is.
Yeah.
Whether coming back to what you mentioned earlier about this complexity of, I mean, that in general, if you think about the research infrastructure, it can also join via this EOSC association, and then the kind of the rules of participation is tackled like that. And then this issue about the duality, if that there is still a kind of guidelines coming from the different groups. So I think that this is something that I think that would be good to also to brought up when presenting particularly the first one, because I think that it's more related to that what is the channel of participation, and what would be then the steps for that participation for different organizations and activities.
Just a question to the timing. I think we need to return to the room, right? Because here it says in the program, summary of key points from each breakout session, 15 minutes plenary.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we need to go back now.
Is that correct? Are there some of the organizers of the meeting here on board who can update us on that question? We have 10 minutes more. Please, nobody leaves the room. Okay, so we will be transferred back automatically, it seems.
Are we transferred automatically, or do we have to press the leave room button?
They tell you we have 10 minutes more then?
Well, so if you read the agenda, it says there's 45 minutes for our discussion, which we've now had, and then 15 minutes for summary.
Exactly. That's what I was expecting to go back now.
Yeah, it's true, but I get a message from the organizers in private, so private chat, that we say that obviously this has been changed. So,
okay. Yeah, now we see it in chat also.
Now you get a message. No, we're gonna be beamed into the room again. Okay, then we can go back briefly to the to the results slides. There was a comment, Philippe, was that you?
Oh, yeah. Beam me up, Scotty.
Yeah, beam me up, Scotty, exactly. Actually, while Dale is working fantastically here on the result slides, do you, from the research infrastructure perspective, do you have what is your plan to participate in the EOSC Association? Formally, Philip, please.
Yeah, we plan to. We are filling the form. I am working on the document right now. For Genti, for press, this is still under discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So it will be a membership, full membership or observer.
For Genti, the French National HPC Agency, that will be a membership, full membership. And I hope I will be able to convince the press to get in, but you know, it's complicated to have a vote on that with a huge infrastructure with 27 countries member. It's always difficult. It takes time. And honestly, also we had some difficult time with EOSC. The result of some of the last call has been somehow disappointing.
Mm. Others?
Yeah, I would probably say from the actress point of view, as just reminding us for the previous speaker that it is always a combination of, I mean, that several countries, we will have an organization of 20 countries. So it is not trivial just to push the papers in. So it will be a long process. And also we have to be aware very well of all the budgeting issues, requirements, and so forth when you are presenting that to the countries as the members.
Hmm. Yeah, we have I don't know in systems theory how the correct term is, but we have several network layers and they're actually not organized along the same dimensions here. So we have several membership organizations in the thematic research infrastructure, which are made up of country members in most of the cases with official ministerial representation in the case of ERICS, for example. And so the governance process in the individual thematic research, disciplinary research infrastructures is basically it's the same model as is also applied in the EOSC Association. And how the relation between the governance in the individual disciplinary infrastructures relates to the governance in the EOSC Association is a rather complex end-to-end question. Yeah, and that comes here in the rules, for example, and how RIs can contribute in a representative way in developing rules.
Yeah.
Complex. Yeah.
Exactly correct.
Okay, so Dale, where are we? So you say we pose the questions. So we briefly just read the questions. We say that we had a good discussion about open to all, mixed views about the to develop implementation guidelines for disciplinary or thematic research infrastructures. If so, people felt ESFRI should be involved, but there were also other opinions, so I will mention that. I will not mention the opinions because there will not be time. And a strong agreement that there should be a process be found about for participating in the having the thematic research infrastructures be represented in the EOSC association for developing the rules. Then the question of the membership and representational power within the membership, I think I will mention that as an open point in a way. But that's a governance question that we cannot solve here. And then I will briefly show the responses, but only to give an indication. So, is that okay with you?
Yes, it's fine with me. As long as participants feel that this is a fair summary of what we've discussed. So yes, if nobody's making any objections, then I think we're okay with them.
We can have another Google form for it. No, somebody said agreed. Yeah, fine for me. Great. So anybody who wants to take a comfort break, because we have been on the screen for a while now, please feel free to switch off your camera and microphone and go, because we have 2 minutes left until we're being beamed into the conference room. So we can return to our private discussions we had earlier. Andrew, how are you holding up there? Enough coffee available?
If I have coffee now, I won't be able to get to sleep in 15 minutes when I think we stop. So, so no, I'm foregoing my coffee, I'm afraid. I'm relying on the excitement of the conversation to keep me awake.
I'm doing my best, but the rules of participation is not the most exciting topic.
Well, it depends on what you're interested in, I guess. For me, I still remember vividly the conversation we had around the rules at the meeting in Helsinki. It was a very lively discussion. So
yeah.
Well, the rules of participation is very interesting and important for me. We must be very careful with these rules not to prevent any of our communities or partners to be able to join EOS. And we said that the devil is in the detail. So this is something that we must draft very carefully. This is not something that will stay in the history. We will not stay. There will not be statue of us working on the great rules of participation of EOS. But if something went wrong, this could be also because of that. So
yeah, but I also think it's worth remembering the point that Juan made in his talk, which is that the rules are not just a set of things. They're also statements of intent. The rules are a way of codifying what what you care about and the behavior you want to model. So for that reason also, I think it's important to get it right.
Yeah, and we have to recognize that they will be something that evolves over many years. Just like the policy statements that we've had about open data have been at least 10 years in the making and are gradually evolving, gradually being more harmonized across disciplines and things like that.
Well, what's important is not the rule by itself, it's the spirit of the rules and what we are doing it.
So the commentary, Juan, is the commentary going to be more an explanation of the spirit of the rule as opposed to the letter of the rule?
I think it's issues, sort of where there are different considerations. We'll try and expand on those because it's, so when we did the consultation back in the spring, quite a lot of the feedback was, well, these are very general principles. Why don't you get down and give us the real rules. And so I suppose the commentary is partly going to be saying, well, this is deliberately staying abstract because we recognize that there are many opinions out there and we can't be too prescriptive in why. I suppose it's the why the rules are there that would come out in the commentary.
Okay, so the rules are the what and the commentary is the why. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing is for sure is that for providing access to our HPC facilities, we will try as much as possible to follow these rules. And we'll try to do that whether within EOSC or outside the EOSC, if that's not possible to bridge the link between EOSC and Euro HPC facilities.
So we're still not being beamed up. Do we have to say something? Like beam me up, Eleni?
So we have been joined by Eleni and Yanis. So we are clearly the chosen room because we have the overall moderator with us.
Right.
But the moderator has nothing to do with beaming. So don't expect any.
Oh, Eleni says we need 1 more minute for the beaming.
Okay. Yeah, it's old technology. Soon it will be taking a few seconds to beam.
Andrew, how did you solve in the kind of rules problem in ACDC? Sorry, that was a joke. ARDC.
Yeah. Thank you. We've solved it by not having rules.
But you had a participation, so you had a competitive call, right?
We had a competitive call. That is true. Oh, there's a timer counting down, 52 seconds. Wow. Yeah, so we had a competitive call, and we have guidelines for who's eligible to apply for the calls and clear processes around the selection, the basis on which we'll make a selection, but it's not as carefully worked through as you have done. Mm-hmm. But we have a much smaller problem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the case. EOSC is about operational questions, and that is a qualitative difference to having calls for individual services that might be also operational, but this is common operations. It's the most difficult thing you can do, in my experience.
Okay, welcome back everyone to plenary mode. After 45 minutes of intense discussions in the breakout sessions, I did breakout hopping from one to the other, and so I have glimpses of all the discussions, and they were very interesting, very diverse, and so in the end, lots of goodies are to come out of this. And we'll hear from all the 6 moderators from each breakout session, 2 minutes each. So really it is elevator pitch of 2 minutes on what were the main points discussed or conclusions. And let's start from architecture and MVE. Jean-Francois, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so 2 minutes, I'll try to be fast. So first, rather than discussing each and every component of the MVE, I think there was an agreement at least that the fact on the components that were put in one of the slides of the architecture presentation, so they were okay. But the positioning of the MVE was discussed. First, the view of the engineer, who said that there is not enough detail yet in order for me, an engineer, to contribute to the MVE. So the answer here is that we're in the infancy of this discussion, and whoever is a member of an infrastructure, let's say an IT manager in any of the infrastructure, needs to engage now in order for the MVE to go from an overall goal to technical specification, right? So that it's clear that we are at that stage where we will have to move into a more detailed description of the various components of the MVE. The second part of the discussion was that there are lots of infrastructures that have already faced all those problems, AI, PID, and so on. And they have lots of experience, and why reinvent the wheel? So the answer here was the discussion, and the answer was we want to federate infrastructure. So all progress, all good things that are coming from infrastructures, they need, and EOS need to leverage upon, to use them, and federate those gems into something which bring value to the user. And then there were concern. The third concern was, well, we need to deliver, otherwise funders or will not trust us. So yes, there is a tension here between designing the MVE in a way that will have the best potential on the one hand, and on the other hand, having success stories and results that will convince funders to continue to fund. So there was those various view angles on the same problem, the definition of the MVE, from the engineers, from the infrastructure manager, and from the funder perspective. So that was the discussion of the architecture.
Thank you very much, Jean-François. Françoise, FAIR Breakout 1.
You have a slide here. The letters are very small, but they have a heavy weight in discussions. The discussion was very, very interesting. And I think we have more things taken in notes that will be transmitted to the project. So these are only a few points. The fact that it's interesting and useful not to reinvent the wheel when one begins now, especially for the small infrastructures. There are different levels of interoperability, and this has to be fully taken into account. You can use subclusters to define different levels progressively. There is a strong need for collaboration to share best practices, implement them, find solutions. And there is a need for support to EOSC, and there is also a need that the communities work themselves, in particular to define their standards and the practices they need for their own requirements. On the research infrastructure side, it was shown that it's extremely useful to have a policy and a framework which applies both to the research infrastructure itself and to its users in terms of what to do with data. And and we also found that it's really useful that everything is shared, including these policies. The things that there are many examples of best practices now, and that it's useful to share the examples. And it was mentioned that publishing in journals is useful to convince yourself of what you have done, how you have implemented FAIR for your community, convince yourself, convince your colleagues, think about what you have done, and also in the end, convince your boss and share with the others, basically. So again, document and publish everything. It was also noted from the discussion that the FAIR principles are very useful to guide work and to help people to understand what to do, but there is a need for guidance, and there would be a need for guidance on each criterion linked to the FAIR principles, how to implement them, and what to do when you are in your own case compared to people who are in other contexts. So guidance is needed, and in general, it does not exist. The publications were mentioned both as, in some case, a kind of data, and also that you have to publish data in synergy with publications, so interact with the publishers. The specific difficulty of interoperability was mentioned, of course, with these different levels of interoperability, as cited before. And one has to deal with complexity of the data before even reaching the interoperability layer, especially in some disciplines. So we can finish with recommendations, which are recommendations to EOSC and to EC. There is a need to have a two-way dialogue between EOSC and the stakeholders, in particular the research infrastructures. Support is needed because culture, there is a need to change culture, there is a need to define standards, there is a need to implement fairness, and there is a need to talk to the community. So there is a need for support. And it's not always easy in the framework of the current usual calls from Brussels. And again, guidance is badly needed. And changing culture is difficult, and you cannot do it from scratch, and you need support for that.
Thank you very much, Françoise. FAIR breakout number 2, Andy. Two minutes.
Unmute, you can hear me? Let's see if I can share.
Yes, we can hear you.
I wanted to just share the screen because I have some slides as well. Is this, you see this? So,
yes.
Okay, so yeah, so we also, similar to Françoise, we had very interesting discussion and a lot of notes were taken. People were communicating via online documentation doc, and Sophie helped a lot with this. It was clear that the people present there were, I would say, some of them really expert in FAIR, and there's a long, the people have been working towards FAIR or working, everyone, there were no one was not working towards FAIR. And there's some people who are very advanced and others who are still progressing towards that. The most difficult issues, let's say, they face are the I and the R, which is not surprising. So interoperability, which also makes data reusable, but it's very hard to measure. Incentives, this was discussed. Journals asking for DOIs were definitely something that would help and is helping to give scientists some incentive. And in some communities, they're working on tools which are mining data publications to actually give credit back to people when data is reused. We discussed briefly on licenses, where CC BY 4.0 seems to be the most commonly used, or at least the one that was discussed. And CC0 can be sometimes used also for metadata. In some countries, we noticed that FAIR is not considered a priority, so there were quite a few statements in this direction. And one of the reasons which was given was that also data sets are still not considered first-class citizen in terms of research outcomes. So people are, let's say, funding agencies or national agencies are still measuring publications more. It's difficult to measure what is fair. So requiring something to be fair by a funding agent, we still are difficult to measure because it's such a vast concept. It's not something which is as simple as open or not open. And what helps with this is certifying repositories and maturity models. Of course, fair is made to be clear. It's not always open, but in that case, at least the metadata should be open. Scientists, we also discussed our scientists are aware of this, and this is still very low on many of scientists, especially we notice there's a difference between older and younger scientists. And also in terms of decision makers, the value, added value of making data fair has still to be